I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Third Paradigm is a think tank on community sovereignty and socio-spirituality. Today, I'm responding to Russell Brand's interview of Thomas Frank called What You Know About Populism is Probably Wrong. Thomas Frank is the author of The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. I'm calling my episode Thomas Frank Misses the Point of Populism, and I'm going to be looking at more of the history that I think he's missing, which is in, for instance, Web of Debt, which is written by Ellen Brown, who is the founder of what I think is one of the current populist movements for public banking. And I'm also going to be looking at a little-known book called Insurgent Democracy, which looks at the Nonpartisan League and its role, its pivotal role in the populist movement. And then I'm going to be quoting also from my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, which looks at that history also. Russell Brand's Under the Skin podcast is on Luminary, which is a paid podcast service. So if you're not a subscriber, I will be giving enough context to be able to, for you to know why I'm right. But I really recommend subscribing because Russell is doing so many interviews where he's asking just the right questions, and they're not just informative, but they also are delightful. And this one is particularly delightful. Thomas Frank has so much information and gets so many things right that it makes it fun to be kind of on this, tweaking this little edge of saying, here's where I think we could be getting even further with this information that I believe is so critical to where we go next, which is why I've included that in my book. Where do I think that Thomas Frank is missing the point? At the beginning of the interview, Russell quotes Steve Bannon saying, "The future is populism. The only question is whether it's going to be right-wing or left-wing." And Thomas answers, there's no such thing as right-wing populism. Populism has always been a Jeffersonian tradition of the left. It is inherently left. And so the right wing is borrowing that language, but they're doing it in a way that is deceitful because they can't really be a populist revolution. Now, I think as my rule of thumb, that anyone's Achilles heel, that place where they can be fooled and be manipulated, is any time that we think of ourselves and people like us as being better than others. And so I think we really need to examine that and whether there is truth to that or whether that's something that is going to trip us up. Thomas makes the disarming statement that when he used to make fun of right-wing politicians, he was very popular, but now that he's criticizing the Democrats, not so much. So he has a lot of insight, and he talks about my team as the Democrats in a way that's joking. But let's look at whether there is truth to that there is no right-wing populism. I've talked in other episodes, and I just don't think it's even controversial anymore, that the Democrats are academics and professionals. They're laptop workers living in what I call the laptop of luxury. Whereas Republicans, if you take away that very top echelon of them, tend to be manual laborers and farmers. They're people who run small businesses. And so there is definitely a movement in that direction that is more for labor. Thomas mentions that Hillary Clinton got more money from high finance in the election than Trump. Now, in my episode on Victoria Nuland, I talk about how her husband, Robert Kagan, co-founder of the Project for the New American Century, which is the neoconservative think tank, had indicated when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State that they would back her. The neocons would back her. She was more the candidate that they were looking for as a hawk then was the competitor on the Republican side. And who was that? The one they were looking at was Ron Paul. Ron Paul has the populist traditions of being a farmer, of looking at producer values, not consumer values, which I would say more is Bernie Sanders. I would not say Bernie Sanders is a populist, because what he looks at are things like universal basic income, free education, all the things that are more kind of social welfare. What the populists were looking for is anti-military intervention, like Ron Paul, having protectionist trade measures, like Ron Paul, looking at an economy in which the function of it is to serve small businesses and small landowners, to improve things like how much home ownership there is and how much farmers are able to bypass all of the middlemen and be able to connect directly to the consumers. So I think we need to look more deeply at what are our values. Are we assuming that we as a society can be just consumers and that no one really has to produce? Or are we getting over that and recognizing that someone has to produce? And if we don't want to be taking advantage of other people in other countries, we need to learn how to do it ourselves and have a system that supports that. Historically, the most important issue to the populist was the creation of money. Thomas gives a great history of William Jennings Bryan, who in the late 1800s was the candidate standing for free silver. So at that time, because of the gold standard, there was a shortage of currency. And as my book talks extensively about Benjamin Franklin and how he shows how it's currency that is an artificial substance that allows you to be able to keep up with the amount of production for the amount of people. As a Kansas boy, I'm surprised that Thomas doesn't mention that William Jennings Bryan was the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, which was written all about free silver. So my understanding had been that he was the populist candidate, but that they wanted him to be even stronger than he was. A lot of the research in my book is taken from Ellen Brown's Web of Debt about this era. And if you look at the notes that I have in here, you will see that almost everything is underlined. And once I start quoting from it, I will want to quote you the whole thing. Ellen Brown writes about how the political system at that time was backed by different monopolists. And so you had Teddy Roosevelt, who was backed by J.P. Morgan, and he broke up Rockefeller's Standard Oil. In retaliation, Taft ended up breaking up J.P. Morgan's International Harvester and U.S. Steel. But where they both agreed was wanting the banking and the issuance of money to be in private hands. And so the two biggest banking dynasties, Rockefeller and Morgan, came together on Jekyll Island, which many readers will already know about. This was held by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was Rockefeller's father-in-law and Morgan's business associate. It included the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, also Paul Warburg, who was the head of the Rothschilds banking consortium in England and France, and then his brother Max Warburg, who was the head in both Germany and the Netherlands. And so they put together what was called the Aldrich Currency Act. It failed, and it failed mostly because of its most articulate opponent, which was William Jennings Bryan, who said that the control of issuing money must always stay with government. But even if it had passed Congress, it was likely to be rejected by Taft, who was a Rockefeller man. And so in 1912, Taft was a shoo-in for re-election. What Morgan did was start the Bull Moose Party and run Teddy Roosevelt as a third-party candidate. That ended up splitting the vote against Taft and getting in Morgan's real candidate, which was Woodrow Wilson. So 3 days before Christmas, they introduced it again, called the Currency Act of 1913. And this was worded in a way that was so ambiguous and disingenuous that it ended up passing. And the person who gave the speech was William Jennings Bryan, saying, now we know that our right of government to issue its own currency will always be protected. So he was fooled, and this was later renamed the Federal Reserve Act. Without changing the ability of bankers to issue the money, we don't have a chance. There is nothing else that ever is going to matter that we do as long as they create the currency that then organizes our labor. I'd like to end by going back to the most important point that I think Thomas misses, and that addresses Russell's recurring question of where do we go next? How do we use this? And that point is that populism has never been right or left wing. It has always been neither. In the book Insurgent Democracy, Michael Lansing talks about the Nonpartisan League. This was a membership that was paid, and they voted on what the policies were that they wanted to be represented. And then they agreed that whichever candidate represented those policies, they would vote for as an entire block. And this gave them tremendous power. They could be able to say, all right, if this is not something that you're going to represent, all of us are not going to vote for you. And if you will, then you have all of our votes. It gave them a leverage. And part of that leverage was also from a group called the Grange, or the Order of the Patrons of Husbandry. I have been a member of the Grange for many years. And as a matter of fact, my bookmarker in this is my, that it says that I am part of the Order of Flora at a 6th degree member. So they were a farmer fraternity, but that also had very groundbreaking representation by women. Now, the way that they did that was by making sure that anyone who was a representative also included their spouse as a voting member. So it may not have been everything we want today, but it also worked. It made sure that women were at the forefront of the Grange. They had their own property, something that we should be paying attention to now, because you can't be a community without a place to meet. One of the properties they own is directly across from the White House with their headquarters. My daughter and I went there and talked to their first woman president and also the lobbyist. They have their own lobbyist where all of the Granges vote and they debate and they talk in a way that is so inclusive and goes so far beyond a left-right divide. So you can have issues that get discussed in a way where everyone is a personality. There's not a way of othering. With the original Grange, they were very protective. You had to know someone and have them vouch for you in order to become a member. There are secret handshakes because they were under fire and people were trying to infiltrate and make sure that they didn't succeed. So there's a legacy of a lot of these rituals that my friend has written about, Ann Waters. And a lot of the rituals, I think, should always be a living thing. I think rituals should always be revitalized. But there is a sweetness to them, and there is a way in which people were educating themselves. That was another big part of the Nonpartisan League, is that the Grange and others sent out lecturers, and those lecturers would teach others who then would continue to pass these messages along. So they didn't believe that democracy was something that just happened. It happened through active research and discussion and knowing how to think. I think this is something that we need to be enlivening today. We need a nonpartisan league where we can get beyond this idea that there is a right wing, there is a left wing, and that there's any difference between them. If you're interested in following up on Russell's question of where do we go from here, here's one of the episodes that I have on restoring local sovereignty, which is a playlist on my YouTube channel. And then I have another playlist on healing divisive politics. And check out my new Third Paradigm at Substack, where along with the video, I include text and links. Thank you, and I love my subscribers who give me a reason to keep posting.